Mark Spencer drove along the deserted highway at night, carefully changing lanes between the rare, lonely cars racing by. The road stretched out into an endless black ribbon, cut by long rows of street lamps whose light spread in his eyes in blurred amber reflections. It seemed that each lamppost blinked in time with his ragged breathing. He noticed that his vision was beginning to double, the markings merged into a swaying, uneven snake. Outside, a steady drizzle of rain fell light, almost weightless, but persistent, like autumn itself in Seattle. The wet asphalt glistened, reflecting the city lights, which looked like smeared watercolor strokes in the rearview mirror. The tires cut through the thin layer of water with a soft but monotonous hiss, splashing tiny drops that instantly settled on the mudguards and glass. Mark blinked several times, trying to clear away the growing drowsiness, but each time his eyelids felt like lead. He ran his tongue over his dry lips, found himself clenching his jaw, and gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. A strange, sticky feeling of unease was growing inside him. "If only I could get there," he said mentally, but even his own thoughts seemed alien and muffled, as if they were being spoken by someone else. His heart pounded dully and unevenly in his chest, sometimes faltering like a drummer who had lost his rhythm. Every breath became harder, his ribcage seemed to be compressed from within, and the air became viscous, like warm syrup. A dull pain pounded stubbornly in the back of his head, echoing in his temples. His thoughts were confused and scattered, as if he were trying to hold wet sand in his hands. The whole day passed in a fog. He had felt a little shaky when he got up from his desk that morning, but he hadn't paid it any attention. The dizziness came and went in waves, and he attributed it to fatigue, nerves, and an endless stream of patience. His schedule was packed. From 9 in the morning until late at night, he listened to other people's fears, contained his emotions, and looked for words of support. The irony was that the psychologist who helped others cope with internal storms was already drowning in his own storm. He hadn't seen Emily much in recent weeks. Their morning meetings were limited to a quick "good morning" and a quick kiss on the go, and in the evenings he would return after she had gone to bed, leaving a note for him on the nightstand, dinners in the fridge. Sometimes he would find her with warm wishes, sometimes only a plate wrapped in plastic. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, trying to focus them, but suddenly a bright light hit his face. The headlights of an oncoming car burst out of the darkness like stage lights, blinding him for a second. He instinctively closed his eyes, his heart sinking. At that moment, his head began to spin so sharply that the world went in waves. His fingers weakened, the steering wheel turned slightly in his hands. The car jerked, almost touching the dividing line. Mark tried to regain control, but the road in front of him suddenly began to double and bend like a snake in the moonlight. Something snapped inside. Fear exploded instantly like a match. Cold adrenaline pierced the body, fingers ran with a small tremor. "No," a hoarse, barely audible whisper escaped his lips. The metallic screech of brakes cut through the night. The car slid sideways, the rear wheels losing traction on the wet asphalt. Through the sound of the skidding, he could clearly hear the rain pounding the roof, faster and louder. The moment the guardrails popped out of the darkness in front of the hood, the world slowed down. Orange and white lights swirled in a predatory, swirling dance. There was a low, dull hum in his ears, as if he were underwater. His hands were no longer obeying him. He felt his consciousness slipping away. The world turned upside down. The night disintegrated into sharp, searing images. Lights, the flash of oncoming headlights, wet stripes of road markings, the gleam of metal, distorted reflections in the windshield. Then a deafening, space-tearing crash, as if a giant hand had crushed the car into a fist. The seat belt dug into his chest, knocking the air out. The pain was sharp, like a knife blow, and at the same time dull, like the weight of a stone falling on his body. And after that only darkness. Thick, viscous, bottomless. Mark came to his senses from the bright, piercing light beating on his closed eyelids. At first he tried to turn away, but something under his head creaked harshly, and he groaned muffledly. Through the thin reddish veil of his eyelids, the light cut his eyes, as if someone had brought a cold flashlight to his face. He slowly, with effort, opened his eyes. A white ceiling. So white that it seemed almost lifeless, sterile, as if everything unnecessary had been wiped out of the world. Blurred shadows wandered along the edges of his field of vision. Immediately, a sharp, dry smell of antiseptic hit his nose, mixed with something metallic, the smell of blood and medical devices. Somewhere nearby, equipment was quietly but persistently beeping, giving out the rhythm of his heartbeat. Muffled voices could be heard from behind the thin partition alien, faceless. He tried to move, and immediately, like an electric shock, a sharp pain flared up from within his left arm and ribs. Mark jerked and noisily sucked in air. "You're awake," a female voice responded immediately, almost joyful. The face of a woman in a blue medical uniform leaned into view. Young, with warm brown eyes and a tired but sincere expression. "Lie still," she said softly but firmly. "You have a broken left arm, 2 broken ribs, and a concussion. You're in the hospital. Everything is under control." Mark blinked, trying to focus on her face. His head ached, a dull throb in his temples. His memory was failing, images and sounds floating in and out like ink in water. He vaguely remembered light, headlights, the feeling of falling into nothingness. That was all. "What happened?" he breathed out, surprised by his own voice. It was hoarse, like someone else's. His lips were dry and cracked. His tongue felt like a piece of dry fabric. The nurse nodded slightly, reaching for a button on the panel next to the bed. The bed lifted slightly, helping him to a semi-sitting position. A doctor entered the door, a young man in a white coat. A badge hung neatly on his chest. He did not have time to read the name. The doctor's face was calm, with a slight smile, but his eyes studied him attentively, tenaciously. "Good morning, Mr. Spencer," he said, coming closer. His voice was even gentle, as if he were speaking to a patient who could not be frightened by harsh words. "I'm glad you've come to your senses." Mark swallowed. He paused, "I don't understand." "You were in a traffic accident," the doctor said without unnecessary drama, but clearly. "You were brought to us last night in serious condition. How are you feeling? Can you tell me what you remember?" Mark frowned. Inside, behind the veil of pain, he tried to piece together the fragments of images, but everything fell apart, like a dream that slips away as soon as you try to tell it out loud. "I was driving home," he began slowly, swallowing his words. "It was raining. I see. Headlights. Then, nothing." The doctor exchanged a brief but meaningful glance with the nurse. She shrugged her shoulders almost imperceptibly. "It's absolutely normal," the doctor reassured him. "You have a traumatic brain injury. Losing memory of the moment of the accident is a common occurrence. Perhaps the memories will return, or perhaps not. The main thing now is your recovery." Mark closed his eyes, and in the darkness beneath his eyelids, lights flashed before him again. But these were not specific memories, but rather a vague feeling something important was lost. Not just the moment of the accident, as if a whole piece of life had been torn out. He opened his eyes, feeling anxiety rising in his throat. "Tell me," he exhaled, "what time is it? And day?" The doctor looked at his watch and said the date and month. Mark froze. In his head, it was still a completely different month, almost a year ago. The memory inside him was frozen on that date, like a stuck record. He slowly looked up at the doctor, feeling panic spreading through his body in cold waves. "Is this a mistake?" His voice wavered. "Are you sure of the date?" "I'm sure, Mr. Spencer." The doctor didn't remove his soft smile, but his gaze became a little more serious. "It looks like you have retrograde amnesia. Sometimes such lapses can be long. We will do everything to help you restore your memory." But Mark clenched the fingers of his right hand into a fist as much as his strength allowed. "Almost a year. I don't remember a whole year." "You don't remember yet," the doctor clarified. "That doesn't mean the memories are lost forever. But you'll have to be prepared for some of the events to not return." The nurse carefully adjusted the blanket, as if trying to bring him back to reality with small, caring gestures. Mark looked away to the window. The morning was graying there, and the rain, just like that evening when he was driving home, was still quietly trickling down the glass. And it seemed to him that he was left in that rain between the headlights of oncoming cars and emptiness. The door of the ward swung open a little more abruptly than it should have, and a woman in her early 30s literally ran into the room. She was wearing a light raincoat, soaked through from the rain, and it clung to her shoulders, emphasizing how she was shaking either from the cold or from what she had been through. Her light brown hair had come loose from her hastily gathered ponytail and was stuck to her temples. Thin strands, wet from the rain, were stuck to her cheeks. There were deep, dark circles under her eyes. Her skin looked pale and tired. Her gaze instantly fell on the bed. Seeing that Mark was lying with his eyes open, the woman froze for a second and then threw up her hands as if she did not believe what was happening. "Mark, oh my God!" His voice trembled, as if shock, relief, and fear he'd been holding back all day were all intertwined in it. She ran up to him, almost hitting the nearby pedestal with her shoulder, and carefully took his healthy hand. The palm was warm, but trembling. Tears glistened in the corners of her eyes, and she didn't even seem to notice that they were starting to roll down her cheeks. Mark looked at her face. Her features were painfully familiar. The soft line of her lips, the slightly raised eyebrows, the mole near her cheekbone. The name was on the tip of his tongue, but it didn't come out right away, as if someone was tugging at the curtain between him and his memory. And yet, he knew her. He knew that she had been with him for years. His wife. "Emily," he said quietly, with some effort, and tried to smile, although his lips were difficult to move. "Hi." Emily sniffled, leaned down, and kissed his forehead. The warm touch calmed him more than words could. "Hello, honey," she said, almost in a whisper. You gave us such a scare." "Us?" Mark asked hoarsely, blinking and turning his head slightly, as if trying to find someone else with his eyes. The doctor and I, the doctor, who had been standing slightly to the side all this time, watching the scene, intervened. He took a step forward, allowing Emily to take a half step back. "We were both worried. I'm glad to see you're conscious." Emily glanced gratefully at the doctor, then looked back at her husband, as if she was afraid he would disappear if she looked away for even a second. Mark, feeling his head begin to buzz from all the sounds and emotions, closed his eyes for a few seconds. It was too much at once. The pain, the light, the smells, the voices, her face. But inside, there was a small point of peace. She was here, alive, and it seemed like he still mattered to her. "How are you feeling?" Emily asked softly, lightly stroking his fingers, trying not to touch his bandaged hand. "It's like I got run over by a truck," he said with a crooked smile. "My head is empty. I don't remember much about the accident." Emily nodded sadly, looking down. "It's okay, dear. The main thing is that you're alive. Everything else will come back. The doctor said you were very lucky." The doctor confirmed. "Indeed, you have a strong blow to the head and a short-term coma. The images show only a concussion, no serious injuries. Amnesia in such cases is a common occurrence. We will monitor your condition and help restore your memory." Mark nodded with difficulty. His thoughts were slow and sluggish. His brain felt like a piece of Swiss cheese, riddled with holes. He remembered his name, his profession, knew the faces of his friends, and could name the streets in the neighborhood where he lived. But the last few months, they simply didn't exist in his head. Everything stopped at some point in the past year. He tried to remember what he had been working on lately, what patients he had seen recently, and he came up empty. Memories slipped away like shadows behind a veil. "How long do I have to be here?" he asked, looking uncertainly from the doctor to Emily. "A couple of days under observation," the doctor replied, checking the readings on the device next to the bed. "If there are no complications, we'll transfer you to rehabilitation." Emily let out a breath that she had been holding the entire time. Mark noticed her shoulders slump slightly, and her fingers relaxed their grip on his hand. She looked exhausted, with sunken cheeks and the look of someone who hadn't slept in several nights. But now, for the first time, A small but real smile appeared on her face. "I'll be there," she said quietly but firmly, looking straight into his eyes. "Everything will be fine. Do you hear me?" Mark squeezed her fingers. He needed those words. Even if the anxiety continued to stir somewhere deep inside, even if there was a burning question inside, what did I forget? Now he clung to her voice and the warmth of her hand as the only thing keeping him afloat. He didn't know if the memories would return, but he knew that as long as she was there, he could endure the chaos that had become his world. A few days later, Mark was discharged home. His left arm was in plaster, his ribs were tightly bandaged, every movement was painful. His memory was still fragmentary. He remembered how he lived a year ago, remembered his professional skills, his friends, but he remembered almost nothing of the last months before the accident. At home, everything seemed vaguely familiar and at the same time new. Emily surrounded her husband with care. She prepared a guest bedroom for him on the first floor so that Mark would not have to climb the stairs. Every morning she helped him get dressed, patiently reminded him to take his medication. Mark felt gratitude and love for his wife. She turned out to be a reliable support in his trouble. One afternoon, as the rain pounded the roof outside again, Mark's old friend David dropped in. David Henson was a fellow therapist and a best friend since college. A tall, dark-haired man in his 40s, he looked worried, but smiled when he saw Mark in the chair by the window. "Mark, buddy," David gently hugged his good shoulder. "I'm so glad you're okay. We were all beside ourselves." "Hello, David," Mark responded with a weak smile. He felt genuinely warm at his friend's arrival. "I'm glad to see you too." Emily put tea and a plate of cookies on the table. "Thanks, Em," David said. "How are you holding up?" Mark's wife smiled tiredly. "It's easier now that he's home. The first few days were terrible, but the most important thing now is recovery. If anything happens, call me. I'll be in the kitchen." She tactfully left the men to talk alone. David sank into the chair opposite Mark, looking at him carefully. "Well, how are you? Honestly," he asked quietly. Mark sighed. "Physically, it's bearable. It hurts, but it's bearable. But with my head. Emptiness, David. I don't remember almost a year of my life. It's driving me crazy." He told his friend how he was trying to pull out of his memory at least something about the last months. Patients, cases, personal moments, and nothing, just isolated fragments. He only remembered that in the last weeks he felt very tired and stressed at work. "I remember complaining to you about burnout." Mark rubbed his face with his hand. "And then darkness, like it was cut off." David nodded sympathetically. "It's natural after such an injury. Don't put pressure on yourself. Especially if you were stressed, your brain could block some of the memories. Maybe it's for the best. Give yourself a rest." "Maybe." Mark shrugged his shoulders vaguely. "But I feel uneasy, like I've lost a part of myself. I want to understand what happened to me before the accident." David paused, then cautiously suggested, "Tell me, have you been advised to try recollection therapy? Hypnosis, for example." Mark looked up. Hypnosis as a method of memory restoration. As a professional, he knew that memories induced by hypnosis were not always reliable. Sometimes hypnosis could bring out subconscious details, but it could also implant false images. "That's debatable," Mark began, but David raised his hand. "I know. I completely agree. The method is controversial. Many people believe that hypnosis can be used to find out what happened in the past, but research shows that this is risky. There have been cases where therapists have tried to dig up repressed memories and ended up suggesting things to patients that never happened. So you have to be very careful here." Mark nodded. He was familiar with these issues. He and David had discussed similar cases in professional circles many times. But David continued, "In your case, we are not talking about childhood traumas, but about recent events before the accident. Maybe hypnotherapy could help restore at least some details, under the supervision of an experienced specialist, of course." Mark thought about it. He was tormented by the unknown. If there was a chance to get his memories back, "I'd try," he said quietly. Only if you were around to monitor. David smiled. Of course. I'm not a hypnotherapist myself, but I know a good specialist. Or if you feel more comfortable, we can try a light trance technique ourselves, since we're both familiar with the methods. Let's do it ourselves, Mark decided, feeling strangely inspired. Let's try. It won't get any worse. David patted him on the knee encouragingly. Excellent. But first you need to recover a little more physically. A couple of days, and we'll try. They moved on to lighter topics. David told them the latest news from their work and asked how Mark was coping at home. At some point, Emily appeared on the threshold. You men haven't forgotten about lunch? Mark needs to eat on time. Oh, right, David remembered. It's time for us to have a snack. I've already satisfied my hunger with one cookie. Emily served them sandwiches and freshly brewed tea. Mark smiled gratefully at his wife. She leaned over and straightened the blanket on his lap. Eat, darling. David bit into his sandwich with gusto. Thank you, Emily. It was very tasty. She smiled reservedly and walked out, closing the living room door behind her. When her footsteps faded, David said quietly, She takes good care of you. She's great. Yes, Mark agreed, watching her go. I am incredibly indebted to her. However, without expecting it, he suddenly felt a vague uneasiness. Something in his wife's behavior seemed overzealous to him. Perhaps she was simply trying to be useful, but she had never been under such care before. Emily had always been quite independent and not much of a homebody, but now she didn't leave his side for a second. Mark pushed these thoughts aside, attributing them to the stress she was going through. However, a seed of doubt had settled somewhere. An hour later, David, having collected a notebook and a small case with some devices from the table, stood up. He smiled warmly, gently touching Mark on the shoulder. Relax. I'll drop by in a couple of days, and we'll give you a relaxing session. Nothing complicated, just to relieve tension and maybe jog your memory. Thank you, Dave, Mark replied tiredly but sincerely. They shook hands briefly, and David, throwing his coat over his shoulder, headed for the exit. The rustle of his steps along the corridor and the soft creak of the front door echoed unexpectedly loudly in Mark's ears. He walked his friend to the door, looked after him at the dank street, pouring with a light rain, and then slowly returned to the living room. Emily was already clearing the dishes from the table at this point. She moved quickly and precisely, as if she were performing a ritual she had done 1,000 times, collecting cups, placing them one inside the other, deftly brushing crumbs off the plates into her palm. What were you and David talking about? She asked casually, without even looking at her husband. Her tone was deliberately calm, but there was something too sharp in it, as if there was another question hidden between the lines of the question, a real one. Mark came closer, automatically taking up the task of helping. In his good hand, he could hold 2 mugs at once. He carefully removed them from the edge of the table, so as not to touch them with his bandaged hand. About many things, he began, watching her carefully transfer spoons into a cup without looking up. He suggested trying hypnosis, to remember what was lost. Emily stopped abruptly, almost dropping her fork, and turned to face him. Hypnosis? She asked too quickly, almost abruptly. Why? There was a subtle tremor in her voice, not loud, but noticeable. Her gaze became too direct for a moment, as if she wanted to check something in his eyes. But the next second she looked away, as if she had pulled herself together. That is, her voice became more even, but the corners of her lips trembled slightly. Do you think this is necessary? Maybe we shouldn't rush. The memory will return itself when it's ready. Mark frowned. He hadn't expected her to react like that. Emily usually supported his decisions without hesitation, especially those that involved his psychological work or health. Are you against it? He asked carefully, trying to catch at least a hint of an explanation in her face. Emily smiled slightly, but her gaze slipped somewhere to the side, to the window, outside which the rain was knocking on the glass. No, of course not, she said, a little more slowly than usual. I'm just worried that these sessions might make you feel worse. That unpleasant thing might come up. Mark placed his hand on her shoulder. He felt the muscles beneath his hand tense slightly before relaxing. "Darling," he said quietly, "I just want to remember my life. This gap scares me." She didn't answer right away. The room became quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the sound of rain outside the window. Then Emily exhaled slowly, as if she had made a decision, and smiled tightly. "Sorry, I'll support whatever you decide. If you want to try hypnosis, fine. I'm just worried about you." He nodded, accepting her words. But somewhere inside, a small, unpleasant seed of doubt was growing. He noticed that her fingers, clutching the cup, were white with tension. "Thank you," he said quietly. Emily looked away and went into the kitchen to continue clearing away the dishes. Mark watched her go, noticing how she seemed to be in a slight hurry, as if she wanted to do something that would take her mind off the conversation. When the door had disappeared behind her, he stood in the living room, listening to his own thoughts. The anxiety that had barely begun during their conversation was stirring inside him more and more noticeably. It seemed to him that there was not only concern in her voice, but something else was hidden there, as if she really did not want him to remember. "Nonsense," he muttered, shaking his head slightly, but the feeling did not go away. He sighed and headed to the bedroom, deciding that he just needed to lie down and rest. Maybe she was really only worried about his health. Or maybe. The thought didn't have time to take shape. He pulled the blanket up and closed his eyes, but the feeling that there was something in this story that he didn't understand yet didn't leave him until he fell asleep. 2 days later, as agreed, David came to conduct a hypnotherapy session. Emily was a little tense, but tried not to show it. She poured tea for her friends and went upstairs on the pretext of tidying up the bedroom, leaving them in the living room. Mark settled down on the couch, trying to relax. David sat next to him in a chair. "Ready?" the friend asked quietly. Mark nodded and closed his eyes. He slowed his breathing as they had rehearsed beforehand. David spoke quietly and monotonously, lulling Mark's consciousness. "Your body is getting heavier. Your breathing is even. You are safe, calm, allowing yourself to remember. Let the memory come to the surface, Mark. You see your life before the accident. The last month before the accident. What do you feel?" David's voice faded into the background. Blurred images swam before Mark's mind's eye. At first, nothing was clear. Colors, shadows, muffled sounds. He saw himself in his office, then at home, at his desk. Here is an image. He is sitting in the kitchen, late evening. In front of him is a cup of tea. His head is heavy. There is a feeling of nausea in the pit of his stomach. "Describe what you see," David's voice comes from afar. "I'm at home," Mark said slowly. "At night, I'm very tired. I feel sick." The picture has become a little clearer. He is having trouble breathing. Sweat is breaking out on his forehead. In memory, he brings a cup of tea to his lips. The taste, bitterness. No, just a strange taste, metallic. "Emily," Mark whispers to himself. In the vision, he hears his wife's footsteps. She approaches, touches his shoulder. Her face is blurry, but her voice is recognizable. "You need to sleep," she says softly in his memory. He wants to answer, but his tongue feels numb. The world is spinning. She helps him up. In her gaze. Mark thinks he sees something in her gaze that is more like cold calm than anxiety. As if, "What's going on?" comes David's muffled question. "Go on. What do you see?" I feel sick," Mark said, barely moving his lips. "I feel sick. I lie down. Emily leads me to the bedroom." Mark's heart began to pound even in his trance. Emily's image leaned over him. He could taste it on his lips, like honey with a hint of bitterness. She said, "Drink this, you'll feel better," and brought the spoon to his mouth. Something liquid and sweet hit his tongue. Honey, medicine. His eyes closed. He saw his wife put the empty spoon on the nightstand. No, she put it in her robe pocket. Her face drifted into darkness. Mark's breathing became shallow, his eyelids fluttering. The doctor inside him was sounding the alarm. This could be a dream, a hallucination. But the vision was so real. He felt a lump of fear in his throat in that memory. He was afraid. Afraid of his own wife. "Mark, you're safe," came David's voice, more insistent. "It's over. You're an observer. What now?" But the picture was blurry. The last thing he remembered was a dark bedroom and Emily's silhouette standing next to the bed. Did she think he was asleep? Her face? A smile? No, it could have been his imagination. Everything faded. "You wake up, you come back here," David was saying meanwhile. "Your consciousness is clear, alert. You remember who you are and where you are. You wake up." Mark opened his eyes, inhaling loudly. He was sweating all over. His heart was pounding like crazy. David looked at him carefully. "Everything is fine." Mark sat up straighter, wiping his forehead with his palm. "Yes, yes, just..." He hesitated. What to say? That he remembered how his wife looked after him. He hadn't seen anything terrible. Or had he? David moved closer. "Will you tell me what you managed to remember?" Mark ran his tongue over his lips, remembering the taste from the vision. Honey sweetness with a bitter aftertaste. What could it be? "I was feeling bad at home," he began hesitantly. "One evening, before the accident, I saw myself very tired, sick. Emily was putting me to bed. She gave me a spoon with something, sweet, like medicine." David nodded. "It sounds like a memory of a cold or poisoning. You were probably sick." "Maybe." Mark frowned. "But I don't remember being seriously ill. Although in the last year I often felt unwell. I thought it was overwork." He closed his eyes, trying to bring back the image of his wife's gaze, her expression. Maybe it was just his imagination, but in his trance he imagined that Emily was too calm when he was feeling bad. But she always knew how to control herself. "How do you feel about this memory?" David asked carefully. "I don't know," Mark replied, massaging his temples. "It's kind of unpleasant. It's like I was afraid of something at that moment." "Maybe you felt so bad physically that you became scared," the friend suggested. Mark nodded, although confusion remained inside. "I think that's enough for today," David concluded. "You've worked hard. Don't overload your brain. Sometimes the subconscious itself gives out information in portions. Write down what you remember so you don't forget the details, and then you can analyze it calmly." Mark exhaled. "Yes, perhaps you are right. Writing it down is a good idea." They stood up. At that moment, Emily came down the stairs. She immediately fixed an anxious look on her husband. "How are you? Is everything okay? Are you unwell?" Mark's face must still have been pale. He hastened to reassure. "Everything is fine, darling. I'm a little tired, but everything is fine." David supported. "Yes, we were just doing a relaxation exercise. Memories are not easy. But Mark is great." Emily thanked David quietly, almost in a whisper, for his help, and her voice was soft. But there was a subtle sense of urgency in it. She walked him to the door, staying slightly ahead of him, as if she wanted to get this visit over with. Mark, standing in the living room, watched them furtively. He noticed that his wife did not ask David any questions about what exactly she had managed to remember, no hint of curiosity, no desire to know the details. Just an attentive, slightly wary glance thrown at him, as if she were trying to read the answer right on his face, in his facial expressions, in the way he held himself. The door slammed softly behind David, hitting the frame with a dull thud, the sound echoing unexpectedly loudly in the quiet of the house. Emily returned, her feet moving softly across the carpet. Her hands were clasped across her chest, and she only released them as she came closer to him. "Would you like to lie down?" she said, with that special tone of voice that was both concerned and commanding, but not rude. "You look tired." Mark, feeling a slight pressure in his temples, nodded. "I guess I will. I feel a little dizzy." There was a flicker of worry in her eyes. She didn't ask any more questions. Instead, she stepped closer, carefully took his elbow, his good arm, and led him down the hall toward the bedroom. Her steps were a little slower, as if she were trying to match his rhythm so he wouldn't stray. The bedroom smelled faintly of fresh linen, a faint scent of laundry detergent mixed with something warm and homely. Mark sank down onto the edge of the bed, feeling the mattress dip slightly under his weight. He still felt a little dizzy. He slowly lay down on his back, looking up at the ceiling, where the evening light from the lamp cast a soft golden shadow on the wall. Emily left without a word and returned a few seconds later, holding a tall, clear glass of water with large drops running down the sides and a small white plastic bottle of pills. She sat down next to him, so close that he could feel the warmth of her knee through the thin blanket. "Drink it, you need it," she said quietly but insistently, holding out 2 round tablets in her palm. Mark mechanically took them with his fingers, feeling the cool smoothness, threw them in his mouth, and washed them down with a sip of cold water. The liquid pleasantly refreshed his throat, but the taste of the tablets remained bitter. Emily, without removing her hand, gently stroked his hair, her fingers moving slowly, almost rhythmically, as if lulling him to sleep. "Rest," she said, looking down at him, her gaze as soft as her voice. "If you need anything, I'm here." Mark met her eyes and tried to smile. He felt tired all over, as if after a long and hard day, although in fact he had done almost nothing today. "Thank you," he said almost in a whisper, and his eyelids fell heavily. Emily lingered for another second, her hand lightly brushing his cheek. Then she stood up slowly, careful not to creak the floor, and just as quietly walked out, closing the door behind her. The click of the latch and the slight creak of the hinges disappeared into the silence of the room. He was left alone, listening to the raindrops outside monotonously tapping on the windowsill, and the distant hum of the refrigerator coming from the depths of the house. The cozy warmth of the blanket and the weak effect of the painkiller were already pulling him to sleep. And yet, in the half-asleep haze, he noticed that her touch was a little longer than usual, and her gaze was a little more attentive than simply caring. But he wasn't going to sleep. After making sure she was gone, Mark sat up and spat the bitter water that was left on his tongue into the glass. The painkillers were bitter nothing strange, but he suddenly remembered the taste from the hypnotic memory. Bittersweet. His heart gave a painful lurch. Why on earth did he even think of doubting Emily? She cared for him so much. In that memory, she cared for him too. I gave him medicine. That must have been it. But what was this medicine? And why did this memory become so clearly imprinted in the subconscious? Mark stood up and walked over to the dresser where his cell phone was. A reminder came to mind, record everything he saw. He opened the camera on his phone and switched to the front one. He started recording. His pale face with a light stubble was reflected on the screen. "So," Mark spoke quietly, trying to make his voice firm. "Today is the first hypnosis session with David. I decided to write things down for myself, in case I forget again later." He hesitated, formulating. "I saw a memory, like I was sick at home. Emily was taking care of me. There was a strange taste in my mouth, some kind of sweet syrup, probably medicine. I remember her look. I don't understand. It seemed like she was calmly looking without much excitement. Although she should have been panicking, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong." Mark ran his hand over his face on the screen. "Nonsense. Of course, I'm wrong. Emily was very worried about me. It's obvious even now. I just don't remember. I hope the next session will clarify more." He stopped recording. He sent the video file to a separate folder on his laptop, where he decided to put such video diaries of progress. It seemed like a good idea to capture any flashes of memory. He was about to go to bed when, while checking his phone before putting it on charge, his gaze caught the icon for the Notes app. Nothing special, he used it from time to time, usually for a shopping list or quick ideas for work. But something strange flashed in the back of his mind, a thin thread that he didn't even have time to realize, but which made his finger automatically touch the screen. There was only one note listed, and it was dated about a month before the accident. Mark frowned. His memory was so blank during that period that he couldn't remember ever using the notes on his phone. He opened it, expecting to see something mundane, a recipe, a to-do list, a random phone number. But the document contained only 2 words. "Check the blood." He stared at the screen for a moment, blinking. The words were typed by himself. He recognized his style. Laconic, no punctuation, only the first letter capitalized. But why had he written that? Check the blood. He repeated the words to himself mechanically several times, as if hoping that the meaning would suddenly emerge from the depths of his memory. Could he have meant a routine test? Perhaps he had already felt unwell back then, a month before the accident. Yes, he had seemed tired, and dizziness had also happened. But if he had really intended to get checked, why hadn't he done it? Or had he done it, but forgotten? A thought flashed through my head. What if he did, and found out something? He remembered that after the accident, they took his blood for analysis dozens of times in the hospital. According to the doctors, they found nothing critical, only the consequences of injuries. But he didn't ask in detail. And did he remember everything they told him? Not a fact. Emily assured him that everything was normal, but he took her word for it. Mark felt an unpleasant chill begin to grow in his chest. This note was like a pebble accidentally moved in the mountains, which could lead to an avalanche. What the hell was happening to me before the accident? He put the phone on the nightstand, but his thoughts wouldn't let go. There were no answers in his head, only new questions. Lying in bed, he listened to the silence of the house. Emily had left him alone to rest. She was asleep in the other room, or perhaps still busy in the kitchen. The pillow under his head felt too warm, the blanket too heavy. He tossed and turned, sometimes on his side, sometimes on his back, feeling his heart beat a little faster than usual. Check the blood. The words seemed to be imprinted on the inside of his eyelids, and with each repetition they took on a darker hue, as if they contained some kind of alarm signal that he had once understood, but had now forgotten. In the end, fatigue took its toll, and he imperceptibly fell into a sleep as restless as a stormy sea. He stands in some endless white room. The emptiness around him rings with silence, and each step he takes echoes dully, although he doesn't feel the floor beneath his feet. He raises his hand and sees something black flowing slowly and thickly through his veins instead of bright red blood. Oily, viscous. It pulses in time with his heart, and with each beat his fingers grow cold, his skin grows pale. He tries to scream, to call someone, Emily, David, anyone. But his voice is stuck in his throat, as if it had been cut out. His lungs gasp for air, but it's as if the same black, suffocating liquid is pouring into them. Suddenly, a silhouette begins to appear in the white void. A tall figure in the shadows, its face is not visible, but it approaches slowly, confidently. Mark feels the horror growing inside him. As the figure gets closer, he sees it is holding a syringe, and in a transparent cylinder there is something of the same black color. He tries to retreat, but his feet seem to have grown into an invisible floor. The syringe is brought to his arm, the needle almost touches the skin, and at that moment, with a wildly pounding heart, he is suddenly torn from sleep. The room was drowning in darkness. Only a street lamp was shining through a crack between the curtains, painting a dim spot on the wall. Mark was covered in cold sweat, his breathing was ragged, his heart was pounding loudly in his ears. He clenched his fists and saw those two words in his head again, check the blood. And for the first time in all this time, he became truly scared. The next morning, Mark was determined to follow his old advice to check his blood. Under a plausible pretext, he persuaded Emily not to go with him. He said that he could handle it himself and that she needed to rest, since she was spending so much energy on caring for him. His wife reluctantly agreed, especially since David was driving anyway, having volunteered to take his friend for a routine checkup. Emily didn't know that in addition to the examination, Mark had arranged with a doctor he knew from the lab for an extended blood test for toxins and heavy metals. That night, barely able to sleep from anxious thoughts, he called a doctor colleague he trusted and described his situation. He had been feeling strange after the accident and was concerned about poisoning through household sources. He promised to help. At the hospital, David waited in the lobby while Mark gave blood under the guise of a routine procedure. He didn't want to let his friend in on these suspicions, it sounded too wild. And Mark himself was shaking at the thought that he was even considering the possibility of someone's malicious intent. It was late afternoon when Mark returned home. The air outside was cold and damp, typical Seattle gray weather, and the house smelled of warm bread and spices. Emily met him at the door. "So, did everything go well?" she asked, looking into his face as if trying to read if there was something important hidden there. Mark nodded, trying to keep his voice even. "The doctor said progress is normal. The X-ray will show how the bones are healing, but overall I'm getting better." "Great." Emily came closer and put her arm around his good shoulder. Her hands were warm, but the moment of contact seemed a little longer than usual, as if she wanted to make sure he was really there. "You must be tired. Come on, I'll feed you some lunch." He felt a slight, nervous shudder rise up inside him. The thought of eating her cooking made him wary for some reason, but he forced a smile at once. Nothing can be released prematurely. He still wasn't sure. And without certainty, any accusation could ruin everything. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of rich chicken soup mixed with fresh herbs. Emily carefully placed a deep bowl in front of him and sat down opposite him, helping herself to a smaller portion. Mark took a spoon and ate slowly, pretending to simply enjoy the taste. In reality, he was listening to his sensations. Each spoonful left a slight bitter taste on his tongue, subtle, masked by salt and spices. Emily was visibly watching him. "Is everything okay?" she asked after a couple of minutes. "Is the soup not tasty?" "Very tasty," Mark replied, and it sounded sincere enough. He took another spoonful, paused to swallow, and added with a slight smile, "Just thinking." "About what?" Emily tilted her head slightly to the side, throwing a strand of hair over her shoulder. "About everything." He spread his hands, feigning slight confusion. "I'm so glad I have you. I'm helpless here, and you do so much for me." He said it almost the same way he would have said it before. Almost. But now every word was also a test. He looked straight into her eyes, waiting for some kind of reaction. Emily looked away, as if embarrassed. The spoon in her hand froze for a second, then scooped up more soup. "Don't be silly," she said quietly. "Of course I care. I love you." The word love sounded strange. Not that it was cold, more like even, too even. Mark slowly lowered his spoon into his plate, trying to figure out if he had imagined it. He would never have doubted the sincerity of these words before. "I love you too," he said quietly in response, and it was true despite everything. He fell silent, but after a couple of seconds added, "You know that for me you are everything, right?" Emily looked at him. A shadow flickered in her eyes, or was it just a trick of the light from the window? She smiled slightly. "Of course I know, and I do too. You are the most important thing to me. Even if I start digging into what happened before the accident," he said almost jokingly, but carefully watching her face. Her gaze hardened for a split second, but she quickly looked away to her plate. "The main thing is your health," she answered evenly. "Everything else can be left in the past." "But what if the past itself comes back?" Mark asked quietly. Emily shrugged, not looking up. "Then that's how it should be," she said, then a little louder, "Eat while the soup is hot." Mark picked up the spoon again, but a feeling had already settled in his chest that behind this, the main thing is your health. There was more than just concern. After lunch, Emily had to go shopping for a while. Mark was left home alone. Before she left, she reminded him to have his afternoon snack, a special nutritional shake she made herself from protein powder, milk, and supplements. He assured her that he would drink it later. As soon as the door closed behind his wife, Mark rushed into her small office on wheels under the stairs, where Emily's laptop was. He felt terrible about invading her privacy, but the tension needed an outlet. He needed the truth. The computer wasn't password protected. Mark opened the browser and looked at his search history. The lines of text caught his eye, making him go cold. "Buy arsenic, odorless rat poison, how to fake a heart attack." Mark read it over and over, disbelieving his eyes. The searches had been made months earlier, on different days. The last one had been made just a week before his accident. His hands shook on the keyboard. He found his bookmarks. One led to a news article about an Arizona woman who had tried to poison her husband by mixing bleach into her coffee. Another to a medical forum discussing the symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning. The air seemed to constrict Mark's throat. This couldn't be a mistake. This was Emily's laptop, her profile. So, she was researching poisoning methods. He almost threw up from the horror and the growing anger. He forced himself to breathe deeply. Panic was no help now. He needed to be cool. Mark quickly connected a flash drive to his laptop and copied screenshots of the page's evidence that might come in handy. He closed his laptop and pressed his palms to his face. It was all true worse than he could have imagined. His wife, his beloved wife, wanted to kill him. Slowly, stealthily. For what? Why? Blood pounded in his temples. Mark stood up and went into the bathroom. He felt sick. Leaning against the sink, he fought the urge to vomit for several minutes. In the mirror, his face was white, his eyes were inflamed either from tears or from rage. After a while, he calmed down somehow. He had to act sensibly. There was enough evidence, but it wasn't enough the search history could be written off as a coincidence, although, no, any sane person would understand that it wasn't just like that. But the police needed undeniable evidence of actual poisoning. Just then, Mark received an email notification on his phone. He unlocked the screen with trembling fingers. The blood test results had arrived, sent by a doctor he knew. Mark opened the letter and quickly scanned the numbers. His heart sank. The arsenic level in his blood was almost 10 times higher than normal. Antimony levels were also elevated. The conclusion was clear. Signs of chronic heavy metal poisoning, arsenic, antimony were detected. Immediate referral to a toxicologist is recommended. The arms hung along the body. Everything matched. Arsenic is a classic poison, from which a person weakens, gets sick, and in the end dies, often simulating a heart attack or other natural death. When mixed with antimony, the effect was apparently enhanced. Emily was looking for exactly this. Mark closed his eyes. The last doubts disappeared. Now he knew for sure they were trying to kill him, his own wife. Memories flashed in his head on their own. He saw them clearly now, without any hypnosis, as if a veil had been lifted. Here he is 3 months ago, lying in the hospital with terrible gastroenteritis, and Emily is sitting next to him with a face full of anxiety. Here he is a week later, drinking some kind of decoction, carefully prepared by his wife, and an hour later he is shaking. Here is an argument. He shouts to Emily that he will go to the doctor, and she cries, "You don't trust me." And here is the day of the accident. He gets into the car after drinking coffee at home, prepared by his wife. His head is spinning, his vision is blurry. He barely has time to drive away. She, an icy whisper cut through his consciousness. It became difficult to breathe from anger. It was Emily who brought him to the accident with her doses of poison. She probably thought that he would die in an accident, then everything would be written off as an accident, and there would be no suspicion. Mark sank into a chair. The loud ticking of the clock in the living room brought him out of his stupor. There was little time. Emily would be back soon. He had to collect himself. In the first minutes, he wanted to rush to the police, show them the test results, the history of his requests, let them arrest the killer. But he forced himself to stop. Emily would probably deny everything, hire the best lawyer. And his own memories are still vague and partially obtained under hypnosis. Such facts are unconvincing in court. No, you need a flawless setup, like in a detective show. Catch them red-handed, or force them to show their true colors in front of others. Mark wiped the sweat from his forehead. He already knew what to do. The main thing was to act as if nothing had happened, like the oblivious fool she considered him to be, and patiently wait for the moment. The lock in the hallway clicked quietly, a sound that Mark had learned by heart over the past months. He could even tell by it who had returned, a neighbor, a courier, or her. And now this click was unmistakably hers, short, confident, with a slight metallic creak. His heart sank unpleasantly, but his hands acted automatically. The flash drive, still warm from his fingers, slid into the depths of his jeans pocket. He stood up, ran his hand over his face as if brushing away fatigue, and took a few steps into the corridor, assuming an expression of lazy relaxation. "Hello, dear. How was your trip?" he said evenly, drawing out his words slightly, like a man who was in no hurry. Emily walked in, throwing her bag off her shoulder as she walked, and clutching 2 bags of groceries to her hip. Her face was as bright as usual, her smile a little forced, but warm like that of a housewife who had returned to her own world, where everything had to be under control. "Fine," she replied, holding up the bags like trophies. "I bought groceries for dinner. How are you? Weren't you bored alone?" "No, I took a little nap," he lied without hesitation. "Thanks for the cocktail. I drank it. It was delicious." He felt the words falling between them like pebbles in water, smoothly and without a splash. And yet it was a test. The cocktail she had put on the table for him that morning was still standing in the kitchen, untouched. He could see it before his eyes, a beige-white thick liquid, slightly foaming on the surface. Too sweet a smell. Too persistent. Emily's eyes flickered toward the kitchen for a split second. They didn't linger, but Mark caught that tiny flicker of a glance. She walked there, and he followed, keeping an almost invisible distance between them. The kitchen greeted them with silence and the steady hum of the refrigerator. On the table, as in the morning, stood a tall, transparent glass, half filled. Small bubbles froze on the surface of the drink, and thin traces of density slowly slid down the walls of the glass. "Oh," Mark exhaled, as if remembering, "I think I didn't finish it. I'll finish it now." He had already taken a step, but Emily said sharply, almost abruptly, "No need anymore. It got hot and spoiled. I'll make something fresh later." And before he could protest or even reach out, she had snatched up the glass, was at the sink in 2 strides, and dumped the contents into the basin. The liquid splashed out softly but thickly, leaving a cloudy streak on the metal. Emily rinsed the glass, quickly, like someone who wants to wipe away all traces, and put it in the drainer. Then, as if nothing had happened, she began to lay out the food. The crackers on the top shelf, the milk in the fridge, the greens in a bowl of water. All this at a slightly faster pace than usual. Mark stood nearby, watching. He saw something in her movements that hadn't been there before. The microscopic pause of her fingers on the bag, the extra effort when she closed the door, the almost silent exhalation when she leaned over. "Is something wrong?" he asked softly, without pressure, as if out of pure concern. "No, everything's fine," she answered too quickly, too evenly, as if she had prepared the phrase in advance. "The cocktail is just no longer good. I don't want to risk your stomach." He chuckled to himself. Taking care of his stomach was something she certainly wouldn't have prioritized if it had only been about a sour drink. But he didn't say anything out loud. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, as if he accepted her explanation, and noted it in his memory. The voice, the tempo, the pause, the look. It all came together to form a picture in which the center was not concerned, but fear that he had learned too much. Left alone in the dark kitchen, Mark double-checked that the bag of protein powder and the bottle of vitamins were indeed hidden securely. He chose a place where Emily would definitely not look, the top mezzanine of the pantry behind a box of Christmas decorations, where it smelled of dust, old foil, and crumpled paper, and near the entrance towered a stepladder heavy, creaking. As he climbed, he felt his knees shaking, not from the weight, but from the responsibility. He carefully wrapped the bags in an old t-shirt with a faded logo, a symbol of his former, naive life, and shoved them so deep that even the light of the flashlight did not immediately find the white edge of the plastic. He closed the door, put his palm to the cold wood for a second, as if putting a stamp. When he returned to the bedroom, Emily was already breathing evenly. Her hair, loose, lay like a black ribbon on the pillow. Her face seemed defenseless, almost childish. But Mark no longer believed in this mask. He remembered half-forgotten scenes, how she, with her head bowed, wrote to someone on a messenger under the blanket, how she abruptly changed her passwords for security, how he once found a tiny golden scaly glitter on the carpet near the sofa not hers. A funny, meaningless thing, and yet he felt a worm of suspicion stir inside him then. That night, he sat in the living room and turned on his laptop, listening to every click of the keys as if they might wake her. In the silence, the house breathed on its own. The refrigerator hummed, the pipes tapped, the wind brushed the shutters with a whisper-like motion. The light from the screen cast a pale rectangular spot on the wall and made the world on the other side of the monitor ghostly, almost unreal. But there was more truth in those ghosts than in the warm bedroom beyond the wall. He wrote David a short message. Need help, really serious. Not on the phone. See you tomorrow. And almost instantly the answer flashed out an anxious, "What happened?" followed by a second, "Where are you?" Mark clenched his jaw. Emotions were a luxury. He erased the explanation he had started, leaving a dry, "Tomorrow, the park by the clinic, 11:30. I'll come alone." He looked at the cursor for a moment, as if it were a pulse that could give him away. Sent. Closed the messenger. His shoulders seemed to have become a little heavier, but his head was clearer. He unfolded the notebook. In the upper right-hand corner, the date, neat and official, August 11th. Under it, a dotted plan. Step 1. Submit samples of the powder and vitamins for analysis. Not to an official lab, where documents leave traces, but first to a chemical technician he knew through David. Step 2. Stop arguing with Emily, watch her more closely, but don't provoke her. Step 3. Collect evidence of the past statements, call forwarding histories, geolocations, bank transactions. He jotted down arrows and questions. Where was she that night? Who is M? Was the accident an accident? He returned again and again to the cocktails. How long had she been making them? When did this habit start? He scrolled through his chat with himself, a strange practice he had begun after the accident. Notes about each day, tiny strokes on a larger picture. And suddenly he found a post from 3 months ago. E. Asks to drink cocktails instead of dinner, says it's good for the stomach. New flavor, salted caramel, strangely sweet. He ran his finger along the words as if on a trail. Memory, just recently like a broken mirror, was falling into place. He saw the scene, an argument, flashes, the words, "You imagined it. You're tired, you need treatment. Let's not be crazy, Mark." He saw him. In the list of contacts, just a letter, but behind it stood the confident smile of a stranger, his shadow in the doorway, his caustic right not right persistence. Then he backed down. Now no. By morning he no longer felt tired, as if the dark river that flowed inside him had found a channel. He made a list for tomorrow. Dry, clear, hide the flash drive outside the house, send David the expert's address, come up with a plausible reason to get out during the day, check the access point on the router, turn on logging record, who entered and when. Install a small camera in the kitchen, a baby monitor, if necessary. He will explain as a joke. You know, I'm paranoid after the accident. He did not want to be paranoid. But the elections ended the moment the beige-white thick liquid splashed into the sink before it could get into his mouth. Before dawn, he walked quietly into the kitchen, like a stranger in his own home, barefoot, touching the walls. From the drawer where he kept matches and batteries, he pulled out a tiny camera, bought a long time ago, just in case. A drop of sweat slightly rolled off his finger. He wiped it on his shirt, stuck the mount under the shelf, pointing the lens at the countertop and sink area. He checked the viewing angle, set up motion recording. For a second, he imagined Emily carefully peeling an apple tomorrow, with an open jar of vitamins nearby. He took a breath, closed the cabinet. He returned to the bedroom and lay down on the edge of the mattress, as if afraid to disturb the water in the bowl. Emily turned toward him in her sleep, her hand sliding across the sheet and finding his forearm. The touch was warm, familiar, and it tingled somewhere under his ribs. "Why?" he asked silently. "Why is that?" There was no answer, of course. Morning came with the smell of coffee and a damp light. Emily stood at the stove in a soft robe, tying her belt into a knot as tight as her smile. "You weren't sleeping," she said without even turning around. "I was thinking," he replied. "I want to go see a doctor. My head's still not all right." She nodded, turning the omelet over in the frying pan. There was no surprise in her voice, just a hint of concern. Of course, I can go with you. No need. Maybe I'll stop by the park for a walk. My head clears up in the fresh air. Whatever you say, she said, placing a perfect triangle of omelet on his plate. And a cocktail? Her eyes met his for a second, black, shiny, like lacquered beads. Later. I don't feel like anything sweet yet, he replied, and his heart sank, because there was carelessness in that phrase, and behind the carelessness there was a hidden stone. Okay, she said simply, but the corners of her lips twitched, microscopically, almost invisibly. He noticed. He needed to notice everything. 10 minutes later he came out, feeling her gaze on him from the window. His footsteps echoed in the entryway. Outside the air was tart, August, no longer the cheerfulness of summer, with the dry honeyedness of fading flowers. He walked quickly, deftly shifting his bag over his shoulder. Around the corner, at the newsstand, he took the flash drive out of his pocket, the one with the copies of the evidence, and stuffed it into an inconspicuous gray envelope. The address was written on it in advance, a workshop in an old factory where David sometimes rented a space for his photo shoots. It was safe there, at least safer than at home. He dropped the envelope into the mailbox they shared for forgotten things. He exhaled, step by step. The park near the clinic greeted him with green emptiness and morning light breaking through the treetops. David was sitting on a bench, bent over the phone, tall, with perpetually tousled hair and attentive eyes. Seeing Mark, he jumped up. "You look," he began and didn't finish. "Okay," Mark cut him off. "Listen, no unnecessary words." He told exactly as much as was necessary, about the cocktails, about the strange look, about Em, about the note in the notebook and the micro-movements that formed a single pattern, about the suspicion that could no longer be called a suspicion, too many coincidences, too neat time intervals. David listened, clenching his fists, not interrupting once. "What do you want?" he asked when Mark fell silent. "Two contacts," answered Mark. "A chemical technician who will check the powders and vitamins, and a person who will discreetly help with the data, access to call printouts, geo, all that. Nothing illegal outright, but you understand." "I understand," David nodded. "I'll arrange everything. Today. And one more thing. If something happens to me," Mark fell silent. "If I suddenly change my mind, come home, suddenly leave, don't believe me. You'll have a flash drive and a note. You'll only reveal it if I stop communicating for more than a day." David looked at him as if he was seeing him for the first time. "Are you sure you want to play this?" "I don't play," Mark said. "They play. I make the rules." They parted without hugging, like soldiers before a sortie. Mark sat for a while, letting his heart settle into a steady rhythm. He pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket, a plan, and wrote, "Step 4, create false confidence in Emily." To do this, he had to become his old self, trusting, grateful, dependent on her care. He swallowed a laugh, not the most pleasant role, but he always managed to keep a straight face. The smell of vanilla and lemon greeted him at home. Emily had taken up baking, which only happened on 2 occasions, when she was truly pleased with herself, or when she was gnawed by anxiety. He smiled like a boy, peering under the lid. "Wow. Muffins? With lemon glaze," she said with a hint of pride. "I thought you might want something homemade." "You're amazing," he said, and picked up a warm muffin, carefully, with 2 fingers, so that the crumbs wouldn't fall out. He pretended to burn himself, laughed, and glanced furtively at the counter. The bottle of vitamins was closer to the edge than usual, and nearby was a measuring spoon, clean and dry. Too clean, it had just been washed, although it didn't seem to need cooking yet. He remembered it, like remembering a password. Everything went according to plan from then on. He quietly turned on logging on the router and checked the list of devices. One unfamiliar MAC address had flashed in the logs 2 days ago, late in the evening. He took a photo of the screen and moved the photo to a hidden folder. Then he pulled out an old first aid kit from the attic. There, between the bandages and aspirin, was a test packet for heavy metals in water, bought after the accident in a fit of rational panic. Funny, he thought, At the time it seemed excessive. Now excess is his best friend. He will check everything. The filter in the jug, the granules in the coffee machine, even the salt in the salt shaker, if necessary. At dinner, he allowed himself to be weak. He asked how she was, if she was tired. He complimented her on the muffins. He told her that the doctor had made her feel a little better. Emily relaxed. He saw her shoulders drop a millimeter, her smile become more natural. She suggested another cocktail for the evening, but he laughed. Let's do it tomorrow. Today I want wine. Guilt? Red. 1 glass. The doctor won't approve, but he spread his hands. She stood looking at him and nodded. 1 glass is not a crime. And he saw something shift in her. Plan A didn't work. Plan B, let her relax. And he relaxed just as much as the role required. In the evening, Mark went out onto the balcony. The city was noisy, but not screaming. The heat had subsided, and night motorcycles began to ring in the air. He took out his phone and wrote to David, "The camera is on. Logs are on. I'll pick up the samples tomorrow." The answer came short and dry. "Contacts are ready. Waiting." Everything was going well. Everything was being held together like trusses in a bridge, one to another, sound after sound. When it got completely dark, he closed the windows, turned off the light, and sat down in the kitchen in the dark to check how the camera saw in the semi-darkness. Emily came to pour water. She turned on the night light, and a soft orange spot cut through the darkness. He fell silent, simply watching her take a glass, reach for the top shelf, and swap the jars. The vitamins closer, the protein a little further. Her movements were quiet, confident. Then she suddenly caught his eye and smiled. "Can't sleep. Thinking about breakfast," he answered without blinking. "Omelet or oatmeal?" "You think at the right time," she said and left, leaving behind a trail of lemon and something musky. The next day, Mark, under the pretext of a second visit to the doctor, persuaded Emily to let him go alone with David. She had no choice but to agree. It seemed that her husband's trust was on her side. As soon as he got into David's car and drove away from the house, Mark quietly said, "Just don't twitch and try to stay calm." He looked around, making sure the house was already out of sight. "I have some shocking news for you." David was wary, but nodded. "Okay, what happened?" Mark sighed. No matter how much he prepared himself, it was not easy to say out loud. "Emily tried to kill me, slowly poisoned me." David braked sharply. The car jerked. Thankfully, there was no traffic on the road. He stared at Mark. "What? Are you serious right now?" "Absolutely." Mark met his friend's gaze more calmly. "I have evidence." He handed David a folder with printouts and a flash drive, a pre-prepared dossier. While David, still in shock, leafed through copies of Emily's search queries, Mark briefly told him about everything, about hypnosis, and about the tests, and about the browser history, and about the elevated arsenic in the blood. David's face grew pale with each word. Finally, he swore quietly. "Damn it. Mark this. This is some kind of crazy story. But the facts," he shook the sheets of paper, "look convincing. What is this scoundrel?" "Calm down," Mark stopped him. "We'll explode later. The main thing now is to see this through to the end. I want her to answer according to the law, and for no cunning lawyer to get her off the hook." David ran his hand through his hair nervously. "Yes, of course. We need to go to the police. Right now." "Wait." Mark grabbed his elbow. "I thought about it. But I'm afraid that if we just hand it over to the police, she might get away with it. Say she was looking for it for a novel about poisoners or something. And the arsenic, well, who knows, maybe the water is contaminated. We need hard evidence, caught red-handed." David frowned. "And what do you suggest?" Mark exhaled, his gaze becoming hard. "I want to catch her red-handed, and for her to confess or actually make an attempt in front of witnesses." He outlined his plan, to feign ignorance, and even give her an excuse to speed up the murder attempt. To do this, he would tell Emily that the doctors had found strange indicators in him and were sending him for detoxification, a hint that all secrets might soon be revealed. Knowing her determination now, Mark was sure that she would try to finish the job while she had the chance. "So you want to provoke her into delivering the decisive blow?" David asked grimly. "Exactly. And this time I'll be prepared. I won't drink or eat anything she's actually cooked. I'll just pretend, and we'll write it all down." He asked David to help him get miniature cameras or a voice recorder. He nodded. He had a car DVR with a motion sensor and a couple of webcams at home. They would think of something. "I'm still thinking of calling someone from the police just in case, but the problem is that I need an officer I trust completely and who won't scare me off ahead of time, and they won't install wiretaps without a warrant." David raised his hand. "Wait, about the police. I have a cousin, a lieutenant in the Seattle South Precinct. Remember, I told you about it once. He's a smart guy. I can consult with him confidentially. I think he'll agree to help unofficially." Mark nodded with relief. "Great. Contact him, but only after you drop me off so Emily doesn't notice." They discussed the details. According to the plan, this evening Mark should unobtrusively inform his wife about the allegedly discovered traces of heavy metals in the tests that require verification. They will look at her reaction, then act according to the situation. David will set up cameras in the house, one in the kitchen aimed at the table where Emily usually mixes medicine or food, the second in the bedroom on the nightstand with his pills and drinks. "We still need to think about how to protect you when she takes a step," David frowned. "What if she decides to change her method and smother you with a pillow at night or something?" Mark smiled sadly. "Don't worry, I'll try not to let my guard down. I'll pretend to drink and eat, but I won't put another drop of poison in my mouth. Let her think it's working, and when the time comes, we'll take her." David still looked worried. "It's as if you're talking about strangers, but this is your wife. Damn, it's hard to wrap my head around. How are you feeling?" Pain flashed in Mark's eyes, but he immediately hid it behind icy determination. "It hurts. It's offensive. It's disgusting. But I've already digested it. The woman I married is probably long gone. This one is left who is ready to kill me, so I have no pity left." David put his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I understand. Hold on, brother, for the sake of justice." They reached the city center, where the conditional doctor's appointment was supposed to last another hour. In order not to arouse Emily's suspicions, the friends stopped at a cafe. Over a cup of coffee, Mark drank only bottled water. Fearing anything that could have been mixed in, they discussed the finishing touches. David called his brother, a policeman, without going into details, only said that he needed urgent help in the evening, possibly an arrest for attempted murder. He would explain everything when they met. He, apparently out of old friendship, agreed to come as soon as it got dark and wait for a signal, not far from Mark's house. "Excellent," Mark said, exhaling. "A man with handcuffs as backup wouldn't hurt. Just make sure he doesn't show up ahead of time." "Don't worry, he's experienced," David assured. Before returning home, they stopped by David's for equipment. He quickly assembled a couple of small cameras capable of recording on a memory card and a voice recorder. Mark hid all of this in a bag with supposedly medicines that the doctor had supposedly prescribed for him. Emily greeted her husband at the door with her usual caring smile. "So how did the consultation go? What did the doctor say?" Mark exchanged a glance with David, his friend standing behind him, feigning relief. "It's all good," Mark began, undressing. "But, they found one thing." He hesitated as he entered the living room. Emily followed him. "What is it?" she asked, alarmed. Mark tried to look slightly confused. "Well, basically, blood tests showed elevated levels of some heavy metals. The doctor said it might be because of old pipes in the water or something like that. Nothing critical, but they sent me for additional tests to a toxicologist tomorrow. Like, get checked just in case." He watched his wife carefully. Emily froze for a second, her eyes widened slightly, but then she feigned surprise. "Heavy metals? What other metals?" "Arsenic and something else. Antimony, I think," Mark said casually, as if he didn't attach any importance to it. "They say it could be groundwater or something. but we need to check to rule out any bad options. Emily paled, he could see that. Her fingers tightened on the back of the chair for a moment. Is it very dangerous? She asked quietly. Mark shrugged. The doctor said the level is not deadly, but higher than normal. If it is confirmed, we will need to find out the source and, possibly, treatment. But it could be a mistake. I will know more tomorrow. He paused, then added as if to reassure. Don't worry, it's probably nothing. Emily tried to smile. Yes, yes, of course, probably nothing serious. But there was fear in her eyes. Mark could see that she realized that the ground was burning under her feet. If the doctors found out why there was arsenic in her blood, there would be an investigation. She was probably feverishly thinking about how to get out of this. The rest of the evening dragged on, viscous and dull, as if in a half-sleep. Emily didn't ask questions, but her movements became almost silent, measured, as if she was afraid of scaring something. Mark noticed how her gaze lingered from time to time on the teapot, on her purse by the chair, on his hands when he took a glass of water. He forced himself to smile, to talk about trivial things about the weather, about the neighbors. He even joked a couple of times, but the words echoed in his head like a metallic ringing. When dinner was ready, Emily placed 2 bowls of steaming soup on the table. Try it, she said softly, almost affectionately, and, meeting his gaze, she bowed her head slightly, as she had done before when she wanted him to give in. Mark pretended to scoop up some, but held it to his lips, pretending to burn himself. Hot, he muttered and set the plate aside. A shadow of irritation crossed Emily's face, but she quickly returned to her previous expression of concern. The kitchen clock ticked away the seconds louder than usual. Mark felt sweat sticking to his back under his t-shirt and a dull tension growing in his chest with every minute. He knew the cameras were recording everything. He knew David was already somewhere nearby, waiting for the right moment. But still the thought lived in him. What if she doesn't do anything? What if this is all a mistake? Emily stood up and walked over to the cabinet above the stove. She pulled out a small bottle of pills and walked over to him. Maybe at least a vitamin, she asked, holding out her palm. There was a quiet but stubborn insistence in her voice and a strange, almost glassy gleam in her eyes. Mark took the pill, examining it in the lamplight. Later, he answered, and quietly lowered his hand under the table, squeezing the capsule in his fist. Outside, the wind howled. In the darkness of the yard, something crunched a dry branch or someone's footsteps. Mark understood. Soon, very soon, everything will be decided. It was late evening. Outside, pouring rain pounded the glass. It seemed like the weather itself was heating up before the denouement. Mark lay in his bedroom, pretending to read a book. His head was buzzing with adrenaline. In the pocket of his pajamas on his chest was his phone, the camera on its side, transmitting the picture to an app where David and his brother could see everything in the car next door. Emily appeared at the door, holding a mug. Darling, would you like some warm milk with honey before bed? She asked with a forced smile. It's good for you now. It'll calm you down. Mark looked up from his book. His chest sank. Here it was. Milk with honey, sweet, like in that memory under hypnosis. But he kept a calm expression on his face. Yes, I think I'll have a drink. Thank you. She came in and held out a mug. Mark sat up in bed and took the warm drink from her hands. Emily's fingers were cold as ice. He noted this small evidence of internal panic. Don't you want one yourself? He asked almost casually. Can I bring another mug? We'll drink together. No, no, she quickly refused. My stomach hurts a little. I won't have milk. Drink it, dear, while it's warm. Mark nodded. Emily sat down on the edge of the bed next to him, watching. He lifted the mug to his mouth, took a sip. The sweet taste of honey flooded his mouth, and bitterness, barely perceptible if you don't know you cannot notice. Arsenic has no taste, but perhaps she had added some kind of drug, maybe heart drops or a sleeping pill. Mark took 2 more sips for show, fighting back his revulsion. Inside, everything screamed with horror. Drinking poison consciously was against his instincts. He pretended to swallow, but in reality he hid the milk in his cheek, then spat it discreetly back into the mug as he set it down on the nightstand. The mug was more than half empty enough for her to think he had drunk it. "Thank you, darling," he smiled warmly, touching her hand. "You are my guardian angel." Emily flinched, but smiled back. "Drink it all, okay? For my peace of mind." "Definitely, a little later," he nodded. "I'll just finish reading the book first." He lay down, pretending to be absorbed in his reading again. Emily sat for another minute, apparently waiting to see if he would feel the effect immediately. Mark yawned demonstratively. "I'm really feeling sleepy. I think I'm going to pass out soon." "That's good, sleep," she said quietly. "You need rest." She stood up and walked out of the bedroom, closing the door. Mark exhaled, immediately spitting out the rest of the milk he still had in his mouth into a handkerchief he had prepared in advance. Then he hid the mug under the bed so that it would not be visible whether it had been drunk or not. His heart was pounding like crazy. Now the main thing was to convince her that the poison had worked. He turned off the night light and lay down on the bed on top of the blanket, pretending to be asleep. 10 minutes passed in excruciating silence. The rain pounded, and somewhere a clock ticked. Finally, the door creaked. A narrow strip of light from the hallway. Mark closed his eyes, breathing evenly, feigning sleep. Footsteps. Emily returned. He sensed her presence by the bed, leaning toward him. "Mark," she called quietly. He didn't react. His throat was dry from the strain, but he held on. She stood there for a moment longer. Then light steps moved toward the nightstand. Mark saw out of the corner of his eye how she picked up the mug, probably checking if he had finished his drink. Not finding her, he hid the mug, and she froze. Mark groaned softly and moved, distracting her. Emily quickly moved away, holding her breath. A minute later, he heard her coming out of the bedroom and down the stairs. Mark sat up slowly. The most important part was about to begin. According to the plan, he was supposed to give her time to prove herself. He crept to the bedroom door and opened it slightly to hear better. Muffled voices sounded downstairs. "She's calling." "No, he's sleeping." "Yes, I did everything. I think in an hour or two the heart will just stop. I increased the dose," Emily whispered excitedly. Mark felt a stab of icy fury at those calm words. "Hospital? No, of course not. Let them think it was cardiac arrest. He has to see a toxicologist tomorrow. I couldn't wait." "Yes, come now. I need to have an alibi for the morning. Let's pretend I went out for groceries and came back, and he's already." "Yeah, just be careful. It's raining. The roads are slippery." "Okay, I'm waiting." She hung up. Mark's heart sank. She was talking to her lover, the man who, apparently, knew everything and was now rushing to help cover up the crime. And they were even going to stage his natural death. However, their plans did not come true for long. A few minutes later, there was a loud knock on the door from below. "Police, open up," Mark heard a powerful voice. Apparently, David's brother had acted before the signal, having heard enough confessions. "What?" Emily's voice was heard, followed by hurried steps. "What happened?" Mark quickly followed. In the living room, David and his brother, Detective Rogerson, were already moving in, pushing past Emily, who was as white as a sheet. "Emily Spencer," the policeman said loudly, "you are under arrest for the attempted murder of your husband." "What?" she screamed piercingly. "Are you crazy?" At that moment, Mark stepped out from the shadow of the stairs, fixing a heavy gaze on his wife. "No, Emily, you're the one who's crazy to think your crime will go unnoticed." She looked at him as if she had seen a ghost, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Mark, were you hoping I'd be dead when your friend arrived?" he asked coldly, taking a step closer. "Sorry to disappoint you." Emily backed away, bumping her back into the wall. This is a joke, right? You got it all wrong." The policeman was already handcuffing her wrists. "Your phone conversation was recorded, ma'am. The cameras in the house also recorded you mixing the poison. Next, the conversation at the station." She jerked, trying to free herself. "No, this is a mistake. Mark, tell them. Why are you? Her voice broke into a sob. This is not what you think. Mark smiled bitterly. Really? You didn't try to poison me? You weren't planning to run away with your lover while I was lying there like a corpse? Emily burst into tears. You, you knew all along. Her eyes alternated between rage and despair. Now that she was captured, the masks could be dropped. Not all the time, he answered harshly. But enough of my memory came back, and the rest you confirmed yourself. Do you know what's most offensive? I would have moved mountains for you if you had just said you were unhappy. I would have let you go. But you chose murder. Because I hate you, she suddenly shouted, boiling over. I always hated that you were so proper, busy, looking down on me. Did you think I was your property? Did you think I would tolerate your constant cancellations of plans, your coldness? My best years were spent in the shadow of the great psychologist. And you didn't even want a child, your career was everything. Mark was stunned into silence, looking at the face distorted with hatred. Emily continued, choking. Matt really loves me. He promised me a life of passion, freedom, and we would move to California. We needed money, yes, but you have good insurance and bills. Why not? Don't I deserve happiness? David shook his head in disgust, and the policeman only grinned wryly. It's all written down, lady. You're caught. A tall, dark-haired man appeared in the doorway, apparently the lover, Matt. He carelessly walked right into two operatives waiting outside. They immediately grabbed him. Emily squealed, rushing towards him. Matt, no, let me go. They held her tightly. Mark watched the scene, feeling empty inside. No pain, no pity, only emptiness, and an echo of an old love that had died under the poison of betrayal. The policeman, holding Emily by the elbow, carefully but inexorably led her out the door. The metal bracelets on her wrists jingled softly, drowning out the rustle of the rain. Following behind, accompanied by a second officer, was the man, the very one whose presence in Mark's life had been the last straw in the cup of betrayal. He walked with his head down, not trying to justify himself or look at Mark. Emily, already stepping onto the threshold, turned around. Her eyes were shining, but either from tears or from the reflection of the streetlight. Mark, I'm sorry, she whispered, and there was despair in her voice, mixed with some strange hope. He didn't answer. Everything inside was burnt out, empty. There was nothing to forgive because where there should have been feeling, there was only a scorched desert. The door closed, and the sounds of strangers' footsteps dissolved into the night, where the rain mercilessly beat on the asphalt. From the street came the rhythmic noise of drops and the distant rumble of a thunderstorm. David walked over and quietly placed his hand on his friend's shoulder. That's it, Mark. This nightmare is over. How are you? Mark closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, feeling the invisible steel noose that had been squeezing his chest for the past few weeks finally begin to loosen. Alive, he answered after a short pause, dully, as if testing the word to taste. And the rest. He glanced around the living room. Emily's phone lay on the low table, the screen still glowing dimly. There were knickknacks nearby, framed family photos. One had even fallen over and now leaned crookedly against a vase. The evidence of a brief struggle, an overturned chair, a crumpled pillow on the couch, seemed to silently scream what had happened. The house seemed the same, cozy, but now Mark could see that there had always been an abyss behind that shell. I can live with the rest, he said, smiling crookedly, as if testing his own capacity for irony. David nodded. His embrace was as strong as an anchor in a stormy sea. Mark closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel something like safety for the first time in a long time. Gratitude, quiet and warm, like a sip of hot tea after a long journey, spread inside him. Outside the window, blue flashing lights slowly dissolved into the darkness of the street. Emily, wrapped in a raincoat with her head down, was placed in the back seat of a patrol car. Her accomplice was sitting next to her in another car. Their silhouettes disappeared behind the fogged-up windows. The cars moved off, leaving bright stripes of reflected lights on the wet asphalt. There was a strange feeling in Mark's chest, a mixture of emptiness, relief, and the knowledge that all of this, no matter how terrible it had seemed, had ended better than it could have. He was alive. He had regained his memory, albeit at the cost of pain. And now he knew exactly the price of deception, the price of trust, and the price of his own time. "Come to my place," David suggested softly. "Spend the night with me. You don't need to be alone in this house tonight." Mark wanted to object, but fragments of conversations, memories, and Emily's recent glances were still ringing in his head. Staying here meant spending the night among ghosts. "Yes, perhaps that's better," he said, quietly but decisively. "Thank you, friend." He took one last look at the living room. Once it had been a place where he had laughed, drank his morning coffee, listened to Emily hum in the kitchen. Now it was just an interior, empty and soulless, like a stage set after a play. Mark threw on his jacket, picked up his bag from the floor, and walked out into the night with David. The cold rain immediately touched his face, washing away the remnants of the stagnant warmth of the house. He raised his head to the sky, took a deep breath, and stepped toward the car. A new life lay ahead, not an easy one, but his own. And this time he was going to live it with his eyes open. Several months passed. On a cool autumn morning, Mark sat on an old wooden bench in a city park near Elliott Bay. The sky above Seattle was high and clear, a rare gift after a long streak of gloomy rain. The air was crisp, slightly salty, with a hint of iodine and the damp planks of coastal piers. The wind gently stirred the yellow and purple leaves of the maples, carrying them toward the water, where they swirled and fell into ripples and disappeared. Mark placed a paper cup of coffee next to him and pulled his laptop out of his bag. On the screen was a paused video, one of the ones he had started recording soon after the accident on the advice of doctors to document his condition. The video diaries had become an anchor for him in those first weeks, when his memory was still shaky and his thoughts were scattered like smoke. He took a deep breath and pressed play. His own face appeared on the screen pale, with a shadow of fatigue under his eyes, a slightly lost look. His voice quiet, as if he was afraid that someone would overhear. "I feel strange again today. Emily is always around, offering tea, some pills. I'm probably too suspicious. Of course, I'm wrong. She's worried about me." Mark looked at himself, the man who still lived in a world where he trusted his wife unconditionally. He listened to his voice, which sounded both hopeful and confused. He watched as he smiled slightly into the camera at the end, as if trying to reassure himself. The video ended. Mark quietly closed the laptop lid and sat for a few more minutes, listening to the wind whipping the waves and the seagulls screaming overhead. He felt these sounds washing away the rest of the pain. Much had changed in him in the months since then. He no longer woke up in a cold sweat at night, no longer looked for a familiar face in the crowd. He still remembered every detail of that story, but now it no longer caused the same lump in his throat. As psychologists said, along with lost memories, feelings slip away, and when memory returns, feelings do not always find their way back. He no longer felt either love or anger for Emily, only a quiet sadness about what had been and passed. The trial was short. Emily and her accomplice, under the weight of irrefutable evidence, made a plea deal to avoid life in prison. They faced many years behind bars. Mark hadn't planned on going to the trial, but he did. He stood in the courtroom as she was led past, in a gray prison jumpsuit, her shoulders slumped. She looked up, as if she wanted to say something without words, but he simply turned away. The farewell had taken place on that rainy night, and he wasn't going to return to it. "How are you today?" A familiar voice was heard nearby. Mark turned his head. David stood next to him, holding 2 glasses of Americano. Light steam rose from the lids, mixing with the morning chill. "Better every day," Mark said, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that he was telling the truth. "I work with patients a little, consult online. Life goes on." They sat side by side, discussing trivialities, a new restaurant on the waterfront, a stupid article in the newspaper, the latest football news. The conversation flowed easily, like people who had weathered a storm together and could now remain silent without awkwardness. "What are you going to do with these video diaries?" David suddenly asked, nodding at the laptop. Burn them or keep them as a keepsake. Mark thoughtfully twirled the glass in his fingers. You know, at first I wanted to delete everything so as to never remember it again. But then I realized this is a part of my life. No matter how terrible it is, this is my path. Let it remain. Maybe I'll watch it again someday like a film where I was both a hero and a victim. David chuckled softly. You are a hero, Mark. Few could have exposed all this so cold-bloodedly, especially with amnesia on their shoulders. Be proud of yourself. Mark was a little embarrassed and shook his head. I don't know about the hero, but thank you. I couldn't have done it without you. They hugged, and Mark felt that this hug was not just friendly, but like a strong bridge thrown over the abyss from which he had escaped. David glanced at his watch. I have to go to the clinic. See you tomorrow, for football. Of course, Mark nodded. David left, disappearing into the noise of the park, and Mark remained on the bench. He took a small black notebook from his inside pocket, an old-fashioned one with an embossed cover. Its pages were covered in neat handwriting. Notes, thoughts, feelings, everything that he now guarded like a fragile vessel. On one of the first pages, there was a yellowed newspaper clipping pasted to it. It told the story of a doctor who had lost his memory for 12 years and managed to build a new life from scratch. In the most difficult moments, this story gave Mark strength. He looked at the date on his phone's calendar. Today was exactly 6 months since the night it all ended. He opened a blank page of his notebook and wrote, New life. I remember everything, and I'm ready to move on. The words fell smoothly and confidently. He closed the notebook, put it in his pocket, and stood up. The sun was rising over the bay, filling the embankment with golden light. Mark walked along the alley, past children playing, past an old man feeding ducks, past smiling passers-by. Each step echoed in his chest with a lightness that he had not felt for a long time. He didn't look back. There was a road ahead, and it belonged only to him. Years later, more than 5 years have passed. Seattle, as always, lived its own damp rhythm morning fog, the shine of wet asphalt, crowds with coffee in their hands. Mark stood in line at a small bookstore downtown, choosing a gift for one of his patients. He had long since returned to work, occasionally lecturing on psychology, holding consultations. His face was a little older, his hair a little lighter at the temples, but his eyes calm, confident, betrayed a man who had weathered a storm and emerged. The line moved slowly, and he lazily looked at the display case with new products. And suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a familiar silhouette. A woman in a beige coat, with her dark hair neatly pulled back, stood at the far shelf. She was holding a book in her hands, but she wasn't reading it, she was simply looking out the window. Her profile was painfully recognizable. Emily. She looked older than he remembered. Her face was harder, her movements slower. There were no bracelets on her wrists, but her skin had light tan lines, like the marks left by a watch worn for years. She must have been released on parole. They met eyes. No accusations, no excuses, just a momentary silence in which the whole past fit. Emily lifted her chin slightly, as if she were about to say something, but Mark only nodded calmly, as one nodded to a casual acquaintance on the street. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. He turned toward the cashier, paid, and walked out into the street. The cold air hit his face, and he took a deep breath. It became easier with each step. In the reflection of the shop window, he saw Emily still standing inside, but now looking at the book and not at him. Mark smiled to himself. There was no pain or anger inside, just a smooth, clear feeling. It's really in the past. He shoved his hands in his pockets and walked down the wet sidewalk, merging with the flow of people. A new day was ahead, and now he knew for sure his life no longer belonged to the past or to those who tried to break it. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.